My name was never on the guest list. Not once. Not even in pencil. I found out my sister's wedding was real from someone's Instagram story, my mother in pearls, my uncle in a tailored suit, my name never mentioned. I had paid for her tuition. I had changed bedpans for our dying grandmother. I had taken care of everyone. And still they said nothing. No explanation, no apology. Just silence. So I booked a one-way flight to Santorini. I posted one photo, me laughing in the sun, with the caption, "Not all families are worth RSVPing for." 3 weeks later, her perfect groom became the subject of a federal investigation. And suddenly the guest list didn't look so shiny anymore. The first time I asked about the wedding, my mother pretended she didn't hear me. We were standing in her kitchen in Savannah peeling oranges for a salad we'd both made 1,000 times. She handed me a cutting board without looking up. "So, any updates on the big day?" I asked casually, trying not to sound too eager. She kept slicing like I hadn't said anything. The only sound was the knife against wood. "Mom." She glanced up, finally, her smile too tight. "Melissa's still figuring things out. You know how these things are. Guest lists. Budgets. Venues. It's all a bit overwhelming." I nodded slowly, but something in her tone felt off. Not nervous, not disorganized, just rehearsed. That was mid-April. A few days later, I texted Melissa. "Just checking in. Need help with the planning." She replied 6 hours later. "Still finalizing the budget. No set date yet. Love you, love you." That was her way of ending conversations she didn't want to have. I tried not to overthink it. I told myself they were just busy. That maybe Melissa was trying to keep things small. Maybe it wasn't personal. But I couldn't shake the sense that I'd missed something. I told Grace about it the next weekend over coffee. Grace and I have been best friends since sophomore year at Vanderbilt. She knows everything. She also knows when something isn't right. "Did she actually say you're invited?" I blinked. "What kind of question is that?" Grace shrugged. "Just seems weird, that's all. You're her sister." Exactly. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. Grace had sent me a screenshot of someone's Instagram story. I didn't recognize the account, but the image was clear. A stack of embossed wedding invitations laid out on a white marble counter. Pale pink ribbon wax seal with a custom M and T monogram. Underneath it was the caption, "Can't wait for the wedding of the year. Melissa and Travis forever." I stared at it for a long time. My chest went tight in a way I couldn't explain. I zoomed in. The names were clear. The date was printed in gold foil. The 15th of June. A venue in Charleston I knew well. I'd looked at it once for a corporate retreat. And at the bottom, the guest list. Visible enough to read a few names. Grace Ellis. Brandon Chen. Aunt Lila. Even Dad's old boss. But not me, my name wasn't on it. I sat down on the edge of my bed, my heart doing that strange hollow thump it does when something private cracks open. I scrolled up and down again, hoping I'd missed it. That maybe it was a limited list or a planning mock-up or some strange mix-up. Then Grace texted again. She wrote, "What the hell?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the screen and listened to the sound of the neighbor's dog barking in the distance. When I finally replied, all I said was, "I guess I didn't make the cut." She sent back 3 dots, then nothing else. I lay in bed that night thinking of all the times I'd been there for Melissa. Every birthday I planned, every call I answered at 2 a.m. when she was heartbroken, every time I covered for her when she blew off responsibilities. The time she forgot to book a hotel for Mom's surprise 60th and I spent 3 hours fixing it. And this was how I found out. Not even a phone call, not even a lie that made sense. I waited 2 more days. Then I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, cheerful. "Nat, hi. Everything okay?" I got quiet. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. So I saw the invitations. A pause. Then very calmly, "You shouldn't be looking at things that weren't meant for you." "Excuse me." She sighed like I was the one making things difficult. "Natalie, you have to understand. Melissa just wanted something elegant and intimate. Small. Peaceful. She didn't want tension. I closed my eyes. Tension. She didn't mean it that way. She just didn't want you to feel uncomfortable with how things have been. How have things been again? That pause. A gap wide enough to walk through. This isn't about you, sweetheart. It's her big day. She said it so kindly it almost passed for love. I hung up 5 minutes later, my mouth full of words I didn't say. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan. And for the first time in years I stopped asking myself what I'd done wrong. Because the truth was starting to feel sharper than that. They didn't forget me, they erased me. I woke up the next morning with a pit in my stomach that felt like it had been sitting there for years just waiting to be acknowledged. By 7:30 I had already showered, changed into jeans and a navy sweater, and was on my way across town to my mother's house in Savannah. I didn't text, I didn't call. I didn't want to give her time to rehearse. The streets were still quiet, dew clinging to the hedges, the kind of soft morning stillness that usually brings peace. But not today. My hands tightened around the steering wheel every time I thought of that gold-embossed invitation with everyone's name but mine. When I pulled into her driveway, the porch light was still on, and I could see her watering the ferns like it was any other morning. Her robe was pressed. Her hair pinned up. My stomach turned. She looked up as I approached and smiled with surprise. "Natalie, what are you doing here so early?" I held up the coffee I'd brought her, half-calf with oat milk and cinnamon. Her favorite. She opened the door, letting me step inside like nothing had happened. The house smelled like oranges and clean linen like it always did. There were no signs of a wedding anywhere. Not a stray envelope or forgotten sample bouquet. Just the usual pottery bowls, framed grandkid pictures, and her neatly folded quilt draped over the arm of the couch. We sat at the kitchen island. She stirred her coffee slowly, methodically, as if stalling could erase the inevitable. "I didn't come to fight," I said quietly. "I just want to hear it from you." She didn't ask what I meant. That silence told me everything. Why wasn't I invited? She took a long sip of coffee before responding. Her voice was too calm. "Melissa wants a small wedding. Just close friends and the people who bring her peace." I stared at her. "Peace? I'm her sister." Mom didn't blink. "You and Melissa haven't exactly been close lately. We've never gone more than 2 months without texting. I helped her move last fall. I drove her to her colonoscopy last year because Travis forgot." She flinched at that. Her hands stilled on the coffee mug. "Melissa just wants things to be easy. Joyful. She wants a clean start. With people who support her. And I don't." She set the mug down. "You've always had strong opinions, Natalie. You're intense. That energy can be challenging." I blinked. "You mean I have boundaries? And I call out nonsense when I see it." She looked away, feigning interest in something outside the window. "You know how emotional Melissa gets." She didn't want drama. She didn't want to be reminded of things that make her feel less than. I felt like I had been slapped without being touched. So now my existence is a source of shame. "Natalie, don't twist this. Then say it clearly. Why am I not invited?" She stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing her mug as if the conversation had ended. "This isn't about exclusion. It's about comfort. Number. It's about control." She stiffened but didn't turn around. I watched her back, the slight tremor in her shoulders. The kitchen was too quiet. I remembered Thanksgiving 3 years ago when Travis had snapped at Melissa in front of everyone, calling her irresponsible. I was the one who stood up for her. I was the one who told him to leave, who drove her home, who stayed up that night on the couch so she wouldn't cry alone. Now I was being painted as the disruptive one. The liability. I left without saying goodbye. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment scrolling through old photos. There was one from my college graduation, Melissa on my back giving bunny ears while Mom snapped the picture. One from a ski trip where she twisted her ankle and I carried her gear the rest of the weekend. Another from the day we surprised Grandma on her birthday. Melissa forgot the cake. I baked one at midnight. In all those moments, I didn't need gratitude. I didn't even need recognition. But I thought I mattered. When my phone buzzed, I looked down and saw her name. Melissa. I braced myself, then opened the message. I'm sorry if this hurt you. It wasn't personal. I just needed to feel good on my day. I stared at it stunned. Not personal. She was marrying a man I once helped her get over. A man who disappeared on her for months only to come back with a ring and a smile, and suddenly I was the one ruining her joy. The air felt heavy. That night I called Aunt Lila. She had always been the honest one in the family. If anyone was going to tell me the truth, it was her. She picked up on the second ring. Sweetheart, I was wondering when you'd call. You got an invitation, I did. Was I ever on the list? She hesitated. I think. They didn't want to deal with pushback. You speak up, Nat. You always have. That makes people uncomfortable. So I should have just smiled and stayed quiet. She exhaled softly. You're not the one who needs to change, honey. But they don't see it that way. I thanked her and hung up my chest hollow. Later, I sat in the dark and thought about what people meant when they said family. For some, it meant loyalty, support, showing up. For mine, it meant compliance, silence, playing along. I had done none of those things, and now I was no longer invited to the show. I used to think that if you gave enough, loved hard enough, carried enough weight without complaint, eventually it would count for something. When my father died, I was 22 and Melissa had just started college in Florida. Mom was frozen for months. Grief made her quiet, sharp in ways she hadn't been before. Melissa floated through it, shielded by her dorm and her drama classes, but I stayed. I got a job at a logistics firm in Atlanta, moved back to Savannah every weekend, and handled everything Dad used to do. I paid the mortgage for 6 months while Mom sorted out the estate. I took over the taxes. I drove her to the attorney's office and sat next to her when she couldn't remember what paperwork she needed. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't expect applause. When Melissa called crying 2 weeks into her sophomore year because she'd maxed out her student account on books and concert tickets, I wired her money. I didn't ask questions. When she failed a class and lost partial scholarship eligibility, I dipped into my emergency fund so she could stay enrolled. It took me a year to rebuild it. That same year, Mom's water heater burst, flooding half the house. Insurance covered the damage, but not the upgrades. I paid for the rest so she could redo the kitchen like she always wanted. Quartz countertops. New backsplash. Light fixtures from that shop she loved in Charleston. She smiled and said it felt like a fresh start. She never mentioned my name when people complimented it. One time at a family barbecue, Uncle Ray made some comment about how Melissa was finally becoming the golden child, and everyone laughed. I joked that I'd been the one keeping the lights on since 2015. Mom turned to me and said, half smiling, Natalie, don't be so intense. You're going to make people uncomfortable. That word again. Uncomfortable. It always followed me like a label I hadn't agreed to wear. Over the years, I learned to translate the things they said. When Mom said you're too independent, she meant I didn't need her permission. When she said I always had strong opinions, she meant I didn't let her reframe the truth. When she said Melissa was more sensitive, she meant Melissa cried when held accountable and I did not. It was Clara, my dad's younger sister, who once told me quietly after Thanksgiving. Some families need someone to carry the load. And some families punish the one who does. She had been the oldest in their family too. She recognized the weight behind my smile. You're not wrong for wanting appreciation, she added, but you won't find it here. I didn't want a medal. I just wanted to matter. When Melissa graduated, I flew down for the ceremony and sat between 2 of her friends. She didn't ask me to be in any photos. She posted one of her and Mom with the caption, 2 women who always believed in me. I tried not to care. I smiled when I liked the post. I commented, proud of you. She replied with a heart emoji. I kept thinking it would shift someday. That one birthday or one family trip would tip the balance back. That I'd stop being the reliable one and start being the loved one. But instead, the more I gave, the more invisible I became. And now at 32, I was finally seeing it clearly. I wasn't excluded because of something I did. I was excluded because my presence made them reckon with what they didn't want to admit. That I had carried more than I should have. That I had stepped in when others disappeared. That I had done everything they were too fragile or too passive to do. And worse, I never made them feel bad for it. I just did it. Quietly. Without fanfare. Until now. Now the silence wasn't noble. It was convenient. I sat alone in my apartment that night scrolling through old emails. Receipts. Transfers. Photo albums. Proof that I had been there. A few messages from Grandma popped up. She had passed 2 years ago and I'd kept the last voicemail she ever left me. In it she thanked me for the soup I dropped off and called me her best girl. I played it twice. Melissa visited her once that year. For 23 minutes. I know because I timed it. But she posted a tribute on Facebook with a black and white photo and the caption "Heaven gained an angel. Thank you for teaching me how to be soft in a hard world." She got 200 likes. I got silence. I closed the laptop. The lights outside had dimmed and I hadn't noticed. The neighborhood was quiet. I could hear the hum of a train passing in the distance. It was strange, this kind of grief. It wasn't loud. It didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like clarity. Like fog lifting after years of pretending you didn't notice the weight on your back. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. I wasn't jealous either. I was just done pretending that being useful was the same as being loved. It was nearly noon when Grace called. I almost didn't answer. I had just poured coffee and sat on the couch in sweatpants, hair unbrushed, trying to gather enough energy to maybe go outside. The screen lit up. Grace Miller. I let it ring once. Twice. Then answered. "Hey," she said, her voice low and fast. "Are you sitting down?" I'm always sitting down these days. "Natalie, it's today. The wedding. I just saw it on Carrie's Instagram story." I blinked. "What do you mean the wedding?" "They're getting married right now. Not next month. Right now. Charleston, Hotel Ellington." Grace exhaled like she'd just run upstairs. "You're not gonna believe it, it's huge. Everyone's there." I opened my laptop with shaky fingers. I typed Melissa Garner wedding. The first tag popped up on social media, number Garner Hathaway 2025. My chest tightened. There were photos already. Professional. Curated. Like a magazine spread. A 5-star venue draped in cream and gold flower arrangements spilling down staircases, crystal chandeliers glowing in daylight. Melissa stood beneath an ivy arch wearing a hand-stitched lace gown that looked like it had taken months to design. She was smiling wide, her hand in Travis Hathaway's. Travis Hathaway. CEO of Ardent Tech. Face of Forbes 40 Under 40. Son of venture capitalist royalty. The kind of man who made headlines just by existing. In the next photo, my mother stood 3 rows back clapping. Aunt Marilyn sat next to her, beaming like it was her own child getting married. Even Uncle Rick, who hadn't made it to Grandma's funeral because of a sore knee, was there wearing a tux. There were toasts, laughter. A line of bridesmaids I half recognized. I spotted one girl who used to borrow my notes in AP English. Another was Carrie, the one who posted the story. She and I used to build blanket forts when we were 7. They were all there, I wasn't. I kept scrolling, numb. The photographer had posted a carousel. In one shot, Travis dipped Melissa back for a kiss. In another, the guests threw rose petals while the couple walked out of the chapel. The caption read, "A perfect Charleston ceremony for a perfect couple." Grace texted a few seconds later. "I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. I couldn't yet. I stared at the screen, at Melissa's smile, and felt nothing. Not rage, not betrayal. Just this dull hollowness. Like someone had scooped something out of me while I was asleep. My little sister was getting married and hadn't told me the date. She hadn't sent an invitation, hadn't even mentioned it. And yet she had made time for dress fittings, seating charts, speeches. I wondered if she'd rewritten our story for Travis. If I'd been edited out, maybe I was a footnote. Maybe she said she was an only child. I walked to the kitchen, trying to breathe through the heaviness pressing on my ribs. I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. It tasted burnt. Outside, the sun was bright and pointless. A delivery truck passed. A child rode a bike too fast, laughing into the wind. Everything was moving like nothing had happened. I sat at the table and stared at the pale wood. Years ago, when Melissa visited after her junior year finals, we painted pottery in the kitchen. She made a mug that said Soul Sisters in crooked blue letters. I kept it in the cabinet for a decade. I found it once during a move and smiled. I had no idea that moment would be the last time she saw me as anything close to family. My phone buzzed again. Another update from Grace. Your mom just shared the official photo. I didn't open it. Instead, I opened my email. Typed out a message to no one in particular. I am no longer attending events where I'm only welcome in silence. Then deleted it. It felt too dramatic. Or maybe not dramatic enough. I kept thinking I'd cry. That the tears were on their way just late. But nothing came. Just that blank muted ache that sat behind my eyes like a shadow. Later that night, I ordered Thai food. Ate it in bed. Watched reruns of a sitcom I didn't really care about. In one episode, a character gets married. Her sister gives a toast about how they fought as kids but always showed up for each other. The audience laughs. Someone cries. I turned the volume down. My family used to say we weren't sentimental. That we didn't do big shows of affection. That love in our house was quiet. But this wedding was not quiet. It was a performance. A declaration. A reshuffling of the narrative where I no longer fit. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to go home. The next morning, I found Caleb sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I stirred and said softly, "So, what if we didn't let their wedding define your whole weekend?" I sat up slowly, eyes swollen from sleep I barely got. "What do you mean?" He turned the phone toward me. A photo of white buildings stacked against blue sky and sea. "Santorini," he said. "I found last-minute flights. We can leave tonight." I blinked. "Greece. Unless you'd rather sit here watching your mom repost bridal party reels." I almost smiled. Caleb had a way of knowing when to talk and when not to. He wasn't loud about comfort, just steady. Present. Offering space when I couldn't ask for it. "Okay," I whispered. "Let's go." By evening, we were in the air. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I stared out the window, the glow of the cabin casting soft halos around sleeping passengers. I remembered a version of myself who used to believe that forgiveness was currency. That if I just absorbed enough hurt, if I smiled through enough slights, I would earn my place back. That being agreeable was survival. That girl used to replay every conversation with my mother, wondering what part she'd said wrong. Used to fold towels the way my mom liked, answer Melissa's late-night calls no matter what, send flowers on birthdays I wasn't invited to. I used to think maybe if I gave enough I'd be seen. Now I didn't want to be seen by them anymore. The plane began its descent as dawn stretched across the sea like gold dust. Caleb reached over and squeezed my hand. When we stepped into the bright sun of Santorini, I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was lighter. Less weighted by what I'd left behind. Our villa was small, perched on a quiet hill in Oya with shutters painted turquoise and a patio that opened straight to the Aegean. Inside the walls were chalk white, the floors smooth stone. A single olive tree stood in the corner like a sentinel. We unpacked slowly, wordlessly. Caleb poured coffee. I pulled my hair into a loose braid and stepped barefoot outside. The ocean shimmered impossibly blue, like someone had dialed up the saturation on the world. Below, small boats dotted the water. The air smelled of salt and something sweet like figs or sun-warmed stone. This was the first place in months where my body didn't feel like it had to brace for anything. That afternoon, we wandered through narrow streets, stopping for fruit, a loaf of warm bread, a wedge of local cheese. Caleb bought me a linen dress from a stall run by an old woman who insisted I try it on, then told me I looked like sunlight. I laughed. It surprised me how much I meant it. We returned to the villa just as the sky turned gold. I sat at the table with my coffee, scrolling absently through my phone. That's when I saw it. My mother had blocked me. Not unfriended. Blocked. Melissa too. Her Instagram was no longer visible. Not even her profile photo. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not out of shock, Not even pain. Just the strange, absurd finality of it. They had moved on. Officially. No texts, no calls, no explanation. Just gone. I opened the camera, took a photo of the view. The white balcony rail. The sea beyond it. The quiet proof that I existed here too. Then I opened Instagram. Captioned it, "Not all family is worth RSVP." Caleb walked in with 2 plates of fruit and looked over my shoulder. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said. "It's not revenge. It's a boundary." He nodded and set the plates down. I didn't check the likes. Didn't read the comments. Just let it sit there like a stone dropped in a still lake. That night we lit candles on the patio and watched the moon hang low over the water. Caleb played a jazz playlist. I rested my head on his shoulder and didn't say much. The silence wasn't empty. It was mine. I didn't want their apologies anymore. I just wanted my peace back. Under the soft light of late morning, Caleb and I walked the narrow, whitewashed alleys of Santorini, ducking under vines and letting the sea breeze wipe away the heaviness that still clung to my chest. I hadn't checked my phone in over a day. It felt like leaving a window open and letting the storm pass through while I sat in stillness. But even on islands like this, the past has a way of catching up like a wave curling far out before breaking on shore. We were sipping iced espresso at a cafe with blue shutters and stray cats weaving between tables when I heard my name. Natalie. I turned. For a split second I didn't recognize her, then it clicked. Lauren Blake. She had been a junior product lead at Solix Tech back when I consulted during their acquisition phase. That was years ago, and she'd left abruptly. Rumors had swirled: burnout, a family emergency, maybe even a non-disclosure mess, but no one had ever said the full story out loud. Lauren's hair was shorter, now bleached at the ends. She wore sunglasses on her head, a linen tote slung over one shoulder, and a look on her face like she'd been waiting years to talk. "I'm sorry to drop in like this," she said, "but I saw your post. The one with the villa view. I figured it had to be you." I blinked, startled. "Wait, you're here, on vacation?" She nodded, smiling awkwardly. "A conference in Athens, then I needed air. Honestly, I didn't expect to bump into you, but it feels like the universe gave me an opening." She glanced at Caleb, who stood politely and offered to grab us more coffee. He knew the look on my face. He'd seen it before when something from my past wasn't quite done with me yet. Once he left, Lauren leaned in slightly. "Do you know who Melissa's husband is?" My spine straightened. "Travis Sterling." She let out a humorless laugh. "Of course. You know, he tried to blacklist me from the entire sector, right? I didn't." I remembered Travis as slick, overly charming, the kind of man who called women in meetings "sweetheart" and thought it was a compliment. I had seen red flags, but never the full picture. Lauren exhaled sharply. "He made me sign an NDA after I discovered he was funneling funds through ghost subsidiaries. Marketing vendors that didn't exist. He said I'd misunderstood, that I'd tank investor confidence if I went public. HR told me to take the severance and vanish. I was 27. I took the out." My stomach tightened. "Lauren, I remember you disappearing so fast. I even asked about you. They said you'd burned out." She scoffed. "That was the version they wanted out there. But here's the thing. I didn't delete the files. I kept copies. And back then I reached out to you anonymously, through that paralegal friend of yours, Jody was it? I remembered now. Jody had said she received documents from a former Solix employee needing quiet legal support. We'd assisted with the filing enough to reach a sealed settlement, but Lauren had vanished again before we ever knew her name. "I've rebuilt," she said, "but I've watched from afar. I saw the news about Melissa's wedding. I recognized him immediately. I just couldn't believe you were tied to that family." I paused, unsure how much to say. The truth was, I hadn't been tied to that family in a long time, not in any way that mattered. She opened her bag and pulled out a flash drive, placing it on the table like a calling card. "I'm not scared anymore, Natalie. I've got the financials, emails, even photos. Not just a fraud, he's been cheating on her too. Repeatedly. One woman in Berlin, another in Denver. Hotel receipts, timestamped chats. All while he was pitching himself as this clean-cut tech darling. Melissa deserves to know, but more importantly, so do his investors. I plan to send everything to the press. The Wall Street Journal already bit. They want verification. I stared at the flash drive. It gleamed under the Greek sun, small and unassuming but heavier than it looked. Why are you telling me? Because you're still Natalie Pierce. And you were the only one who didn't look away. You helped me once. Quietly. I thought you'd want to know before it all goes nuclear. And maybe you'd help me again. I didn't answer right away. My mind swirled. I could already see the headlines. The Instagram unraveling. My mother's carefully manicured reputation cracking. Melissa's perfect facade melting under public scrutiny. A part of me winced. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, it felt something else. Not joy, not vengeance, but relief. I used to think silence was strength. That by not speaking I was rising above the chaos. But silence had also let them write me out again and again. Let them throw stones while I held the peace. I looked at Lauren. She wasn't angry. She was ready. If you need a witness, I said, finally, I'll give a statement. And if the press calls, I won't hide. Her shoulders dropped like she'd been holding her breath. Thank you. I didn't know if you'd still stand with me. I smiled faintly. I used to think protecting people meant keeping secrets for them. But now I know better. Some stories deserve the light. When Caleb returned, he saw the flash drive, saw our faces, and said nothing. He just handed me my coffee and kissed my temple. Later that night, we watched the sun disappear into the Aegean, the sky stained with gold and violet. The flash drive sat on the table between us. I didn't post anything that night. I didn't need to. Let them celebrate on yachts. Let them dance under chandeliers. I was here on solid ground with nothing to hide. And I wasn't walking away anymore. The Charleston air was thick with humidity and expensive perfume as guests drifted beneath the hanging Spanish moss toward the grand ballroom. Everything was white and gold and glittering, from the string quartet tucked under the veranda to the oversized monogrammed ice sculpture that greeted guests near the champagne tower. This was not just a wedding. It was a product launch, a brand showcase, a curated experience designed to impress the inner circle of investors behind EventSphere's latest venture. Melissa stood on the steps in a custom gown that glittered like crushed diamonds, smiling for the photographers. Travis held her hand like a prized accessory, perfectly timed for every flash. Their social media manager hovered nearby, capturing content for their joint brand account. The caption was probably already drafted: Charleston Magic with my forever. Inside, I stood near the back of the ballroom, a flute of Prosecco in my hand and a knot in my stomach that wouldn't dissolve. I wasn't here for the ceremony. That had taken place earlier in a more private setting. Tonight was the grand reception, a merging of two brands and two egos under one strategic alliance. Melissa hadn't invited me, of course. But I'd been added last minute as a courtesy when the RSVP list expanded to include extended connections and professional acquaintances. Someone must have remembered that I used to be part of the family narrative back when I was still useful to their image. Caleb had offered to come with me. I told him not to. I needed to walk through this one alone. I stayed close to the edge of the crowd, scanning the faces. Industry people, journalists, influencers. Seed investors with too much cologne and too much money in digital platforms no one understood. It felt like being backstage at a Broadway show where everyone knew their lines, and I was the only one who'd stopped pretending. I checked my phone once. Nothing yet. Then, 20 minutes into the party, just as the cake was wheeled out, a 6-tiered monstrosity covered in edible gold leaf. I felt it. A ripple. Phones buzzing softly in pockets. People glancing down, pausing mid-conversation. A hush spreading like the first breath before a storm. Across the room, I saw a woman in a burgundy cocktail dress scroll through her screen, then nudged the man beside her. He raised an eyebrow, showed his own screen in response. A whisper passed between them, then they both looked up at Travis. Another buzz. A man in a navy suit glanced at his Apple Watch, did a double take, then looked up too. One by one, heads turned. I felt my own phone vibrate. I didn't need to check it. I already knew what it was. Lauren had sent the package. She'd promised me 48 hours and she kept her word. Photos, documents, internal emails, financial discrepancies. But it was the photo the tech magazine ran on their front page that did the damage. Travis in Miami. 3 weeks ago. His hand resting on the lower back of a woman who was very much not Melissa. Her face half obscured by sunglasses, his posture relaxed, casual, unmistakably intimate. A timestamp confirmed it. Right in the middle of his East Coast press tour for Eventsphere's beta launch. The magazine had titled the piece The Double Life of Ti.K.'s Golden Groom. I looked toward the stage. Travis was still smiling, holding Melissa's hand as they posed near the cake for yet another round of photos. He hadn't noticed yet. But Melissa had. She leaned slightly away from him, her posture stiffening. Her eyes scanned the crowd and then narrowed, confused. People weren't clapping, they weren't cheering. They were murmuring, whispering behind manicured hands and champagne flutes. A photographer lowered his camera. And then her maid of honor approached, her phone in hand. She said something low into Melissa's ear. Melissa blinked, took the phone, stared at the screen for a long moment. Her smile faltered. She turned to Travis slowly. He said something, I couldn't hear what, but she didn't respond, just handed him the phone. He looked down. His face went pale. A sound system hiccuped somewhere in the room. Someone dropped a fork. The string quartet stopped mid-note, and then Melissa walked off the stage. Not in a sprint. Not in tears. Just a clean, elegant turn, her train swishing softly behind her. She disappeared through the side door, flanked by 2 of her bridesmaids. Travis stood frozen, phone still in his hand, as a low murmur turned into a swell of voices. The buzz was no longer subtle. Phones were out in the open now. Screens glowed with the same article, the same damning photo, the same headline bold as thunder. I didn't move. I didn't need to. A man I vaguely recognized as one of Travis's earliest investors turned to his companion and said in a flat voice, "This is going to tank their valuation overnight." The companion replied, "I pulled out last week. I had a hunch." The music tried to resume, but it was too late. The atmosphere had changed. What had been a glittering celebration now felt like a crime scene before the sirens. Guests began to gather their things, whispering apologies, making polite excuses. The cake was untouched. Travis looked around, searching for someone, maybe Melissa, maybe a crisis manager, maybe even me. Our eyes met briefly. He looked at me like he wasn't sure whether to plead or blame. I tilted my head slightly, then turned away. I walked out through the side corridor, past a wall of orchids and overhyped dreams. Outside, the Charleston air had cooled. Thunder rumbled far off in the distance. I kept walking, the sound of heels fading behind me. Let them clean up the mess. I had no more pieces left to give. By morning, the headlines had reached every inbox from San Francisco to New York. I didn't need to turn on the television to know what was happening. My phone, usually quiet by 8, buzzed with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were polite, others were nosy. Most just sent links. The local Charleston station aired it first. A crisp-voiced anchor with too much makeup and perfect posture read off the teleprompter like it was any other scandal. CEO of tech startup Eventsphere under scrutiny for financial misconduct and alleged intellectual property theft. They played the footage of Travis and the mystery woman in Miami side by side with a blown-up screenshot of the article from Ti.K.T.ok. Underneath the banner read the words "Golden Couple" or "Corporate Mirage." I watched without blinking. They interviewed one of the former interns who claimed she'd been asked to manipulate numbers for quarterly reports. Then, a former Eventsphere developer, face blurred, spoke about codebases being stolen from smaller vendors. One by one, the cracks widened. And through them poured every detail Travis had tried so hard to keep hidden. Melissa was nowhere in the footage. Her name appeared only once in a caption below a paused frame from the night before. Eventsphere co-founder and recent bride Melissa Langford leaves reception after bombshell article release. Later that afternoon, she reappeared. I didn't follow her, but someone forwarded me a clip. It was a live stream. She sat alone in what looked like the suite of her honeymoon hotel. Her hair still had the leftover waves from the night before, but her makeup was gone. What remained was raw, almost desperate. She stared at the camera for a long time before speaking. "This was supposed to be the happiest week of my life," she said. "My wedding, my company, everything we built together." She paused, her throat working, then added, "I didn't know about the woman. Or the money. I didn't know what my sister was planning." I set my phone down. I hadn't planned anything. Lauren had sent the files when she was ready. The magazine had done their own digging. Investors had eyes and ears. All I had done was sit quietly with a glass of Prosecco and watch a man's house of cards fall in on itself. Melissa's voice trembled through the phone speaker, distant but clear. I gave her everything and she just destroyed it. My sister ruined my wedding. She destroyed Travis's future. For what jealousy? There it was. The narrative she was trying to salvage. That I had done this out of spite, not truth. That I was envious of the fairy tale, so I ripped it apart. I picked up the phone again and closed the video. Across the room, Caleb sat reading a brief, his laptop open beside him on my couch. He glanced over. "That it. She went live," I said. "Called me jealous. Said I ruined her life." He raised an eyebrow. "Did you number I just let the truth speak louder than her denial? I didn't owe her my silence. Not anymore." Another message buzzed in. This one from an old colleague at my current firm. "Saw the news. Hope you're okay. And hey, thank you." That was it. No judgment, no pity, just acknowledgement. I hadn't realized how badly I needed it. Over the next few days, the fallout continued like slow-motion debris. One investor pulled out from EventSphere's Series C round, citing reputational risk. Another paused funding until a full audit could be completed. A former vendor filed a civil suit for breach of contract. The Ti.K.T.ok article was updated with more sources now quoting someone close to the board. Travis's lawyers tried to spin it as a coordinated smear campaign. No one bought it. The only thing louder than the downfall was Melissa's silence. After the live stream, she vanished from public view. No more posts, no more quotes, no photoshoots with coordinated outfits. The wedding content disappeared from the company's Instagram page. Their PR firm issued a vague statement about refocusing on core values and transparency. I went back to work like nothing had happened. Court filings, client meetings, research memos. My world had moved on. But people talked, of course. In elevators. In office kitchens. Not always loudly, but enough that I heard snippets. "Isn't she the sister of that woman from EventSphere? Yeah?" But she handled it like a pro. Every whisper that once reduced me to someone's awkward +1 or forgotten relative now carried a new tone. Respect. Maybe even fear. One morning, as I stepped out of the elevator with my coffee, a junior associate held the door open and said, "I read your name in the byline. Legal counsel on the whistleblower suit." I nodded. "Nice work," she said. "Clean. Precise." I didn't reply, just smiled and kept walking. In my apartment that night, I curled up on the couch with the windows open, a breeze slipping through the sheer curtains. Caleb joined me a few minutes later, his phone in hand. "You're not going to believe this," he said, dropping next to me. What he showed me, the screen. Melissa had updated her bio. Just 4 words. "Taking time to heal privately," no link, no explanation. No dramatic farewell. For the first time, it wasn't about controlling the narrative. It was about surrendering to it. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. I just closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me like a blanket. The truth had found its voice. And it had no interest in whispering anymore. It started with an email. Subject line, "Just wanted to say." The name on the sender was familiar, but the tone was not. Evelyn Langford, my mother, the woman who once told me to smile more and speak less, had written exactly 5 lines. I didn't know it would turn into this. "You've always been too sharp, Natalie. Too unforgiving. But maybe I should have listened more. I hope you're happy now." There was no greeting, no sign-off. Just those strange floating words, like she had typed them while pacing or smoking or clutching a glass of wine too tightly. I read it once, then again, and then I archived it without replying. I wasn't angry. I just didn't see the point. For so long I had craved something like that. Some sort of recognition. A small admission that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't always been right about me. But when it came, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like someone knocking on a door I no longer lived behind. That same week, I got a message from Aunt Rose, my mother's older cousin who always sent elaborate Christmas cards and once gave me a charm bracelet when I graduated law school. Her message was simple. We should have stood up for you. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that. I didn't reply to her either. But I stared at the screen for a long time. There was something different in her words. No excuses, no attempt to soften the past, just quiet truth. Caleb noticed me lingering at the kitchen counter, phone in hand, coffee untouched. Everything okay? I nodded. Just family catching up. He didn't press, he never did. Later that afternoon, my cousin Samantha called. She never called. We were close once in college until our families started drawing lines we didn't know existed. She was quiet at first, then she said she'd seen the broadcast. Everyone had. And that the group chat with our extended family had exploded after it aired. You know how Grandma's Bridge Club watches the 6 o'clock news religiously? Well, guess who's suddenly public enemy number one? I smiled into the receiver. Let me guess. Mom. Oh, yeah. She tried to defend herself, said she didn't know what Travis and Melissa were up to. But nobody's buying it. I mean, you were her daughter, her firstborn, and she just erased you. There was a long pause, then Samantha added, I think some people finally realized how much they let her get away with. That evening, I went for a walk. The air was warm, not quite summer yet, but close. I passed families on porches, couples walking dogs, kids on scooters. It was the kind of evening that used to make me feel lonely, like everyone else had found their place while I was still searching for mine. But now something had shifted. I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. I didn't feel like I had anything to prove. There was no pressure to make sense of everything that had unraveled. No need to explain myself. I didn't want revenge. I never had. What I wanted was the space to breathe again, and maybe that was starting to happen. A few days later, someone forwarded me a clip from a daytime talk show. One of those morning panels where women in pastel blazers discuss everything from celebrity breakups to social justice. The segment was titled When Family Fails You. One of the hosts mentioned Eventsphere's scandal without naming names. She said something about how society still expects daughters to be silent, to be pleasant, to accept being overlooked. Then another host chimed in saying sometimes the only way to get peace is to let the silence end. It wasn't about me. Not directly, but it felt close. That week, the Langford family name started showing up in less flattering corners of the internet. A niche financial blog wrote about how nepotism at startups creates blind spots. A former wedding guest tweeted that Melissa had always seemed fake even in college. A distant cousin posted a vague Facebook status about loyalty and who deserves it. No one mentioned me outright, but the undercurrent was loud enough. And my mother, she disappeared from social media altogether. Her Instagram, once a polished grid of brunches and charity events and garden parties, went private. Her Facebook went dormant. She didn't show up at the monthly Women's Guild luncheon, according to Aunt Rose. Apparently, people were whispering. What kind of mother turns her back on her own daughter? Even those who once nodded along to her critiques of me now kept their distance. Her circle grew quieter, smaller, less confident. One night, I checked the inbox where her email still sat unopened since that first day. I hovered over it, then closed the tab. I didn't want to punish her. I just didn't have anything left to say. When people ask me now how it felt, I never really know what to tell them. There was no triumph. No vindication. Just stillness. It's strange how peace sneaks in, not like fireworks, but like a door you forgot was open. And one day you step outside and realize the storm is behind you. I made dinner for myself that night. Nothing fancy, just roasted vegetables and salmon. Caleb stayed late at the firm and the apartment was quiet. I didn't turn on music or television. I just ate washed dishes and let the quiet wrap around me like a soft coat. Sometimes letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding that not everyone who raised you was capable of loving you the way you needed. And that's not your fault. It never was. We flew back to Austin in early spring. The air was dry brisk in the mornings, but softening by noon, and the city felt the same and entirely different. Maybe it was me who had changed. Maybe it was what I was bringing with me. Caleb held my hand as we stepped out of the terminal. No drama, no photographers, no reporters. Just the two of us and a second chance. That week, I signed a new contract with Horizon Bridge, a venture capital firm led by a woman named Denise Alston who had once taught 8th grade in Mississippi before entering the world of educational startups. She wore chunky blue glasses and carried a thermos of chai everywhere she went. When she shook my hand, she didn't ask about Melissa or the scandal or what had burned down behind me. She asked what I wanted to build next. It felt like oxygen. I told her about the idea I had scribbled into the corners of my notebooks over the years. An adaptive learning platform that prioritized students who had been labeled too slow, too disruptive, too different. A way to let kids learn like people, not data points. Denise listened, nodded, and then asked, "Who do you trust to help lead this?" I didn't even hesitate. Lauren. She had been on the other side of my sister's campaign. She had seen the machinery behind the curtain. But more than that, she understood rebuilding. She had lived it. So I called her. She picked up immediately. "Is this about brunch or business?" "Both," I said. "Want to meet me at the place with the cinnamon French toast?" We met the next morning. She wore jeans and a linen shirt and looked like someone who had finally gotten a full night's sleep. I slid the packet across the table. "I want you as COO. We'll build it from scratch. Clean. No ghosts in the walls. No Melissa. No legacy we didn't write ourselves." She flipped through the pages slowly, then looked up with a small smile. "You sure I'm not exactly the polished executive type?" "Exactly," I said. "I want someone who won't pretend." We clinked coffee mugs and toasted to a new kind of company. Over the next few weeks, I worked like I hadn't in years. Not frantically, not to outrun something, just steady, focused. Lauren and I mapped out the product vision with sticky notes across the entire back wall of my apartment. Caleb would walk and squint, then say, "I'll just use the guest bathroom." The regular ones covered in pitch decks. We hired a small team. Just 6 to start. A developer from Colorado who had once taught coding at a juvenile detention center. A curriculum designer from Minnesota who had homeschooled her neurodivergent son. A brand strategist who left a major firm because she was tired of making ads for yogurt and SUVs. Every person came with a story. Every story became part of the foundation. I didn't look for perfection. I looked for truth. 2 months in, we held our first team meeting in a co-working space downtown. I brought in breakfast tacos and told them about my worst mistake from the old company. I didn't hide anything. There were no slides. Just my voice and their trust. Afterward, Lauren caught up to me in the hallway. "You're different," she said. "How so? You used to armor up before speaking in front of people. Now you're just here." Maybe I don't need the armor anymore. Maybe I never did. One afternoon, I opened my inbox and found an invitation. Subject line: Leading Women in Tech Conference, Main Stage Opportunity. The body of the email was flattering. They had followed my work. They had admired the way I navigated adversity. They wanted me to share my story. My story. I read it 3 times, then set it aside. That evening, Caleb grilled salmon out on the balcony while I poured us glasses of Riesling. The sun slipped low across the skyline. I told him about the email. "What do you think?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I said. "Part of me wants to take the stage and rip off the curtain. Talk about betrayal and forgiveness and family and power. And part of me wants to say nothing. Just keep building and let the work speak. You don't owe anyone your pain, Natalie, not unless you want to offer it freely." I nodded and sipped my wine. Later that night, I stood in the middle of my living room and stared at the whiteboard filled with timelines and milestones. I thought about my mother's email, Melissa's live stream, the articles, the whispers, the silence that came after. I had learned how to live with the quiet, but telling my story, that was something else entirely. Maybe I would. Just not yet. Saturday afternoon settled over Dallas like a thick quilt, warm and unhurried. The air outside buzzed with cicadas and the streets shimmered in the heat. Inside our modest downtown office, the hum of the AC mingled with the quiet clatter of my keyboard. I had stayed behind to finish fine-tuning our updated roadmap for the education platform. Lauren had left an hour earlier, tossing me a look that said, "Seriously, take a break." But I couldn't. Not yet. The quiet helped me think. There was still so much that needed stitching before I could feel settled. I was deep in slide 12, wrestling with wording that refused to land cleanly when a knock pulled me out of my focus. It wasn't the usual brisk rap from a delivery guy or the soft triple tap from maintenance. This one was slower. Tentative. I walked to the door, glanced through the glass panel, and my breath caught. Melissa stood on the other side like she had walked straight out of a different life. Her once perfect hair was pulled into a loose bun that had clearly been redone too many times. The cream sweater she wore hung awkwardly off one shoulder, wrinkled and oversized like it had been pulled from the bottom of a suitcase. Her eyes, red-rimmed and tired, met mine with a look that was too empty to be dramatic. There was no makeup, no practiced smile, no cameras. Just her. Raw and unedited. I opened the door, holding it halfway, not moving aside. She stood still, one hand gripping the strap of her bag like it might steady her. Then finally she spoke. "Can I come in?" I hesitated. Then I stepped back. She walked in slowly, glancing around like she wasn't sure if the walls were real. Her gaze lingered on the whiteboards filled with timelines, the post-it clusters, the small potted plants by the windowsill. "This is real," she whispered. "Yes, it is." She didn't ask if I was surprised. She didn't offer an apology. She sat down in one of the chairs near the window and exhaled like she hadn't in weeks. "He's gone," she said, after a long pause. "Travis. He packed a duffel bag and disappeared the night the news broke. Bank accounts frozen. Company assets under investigation. Our attorneys don't even know where he is." I didn't respond. I just watched her. Her hands trembled as she picked at the edge of her sleeve. "Mom says I can't come home. Says it would bring too much attention to the family. And the apartment in Uptown. It's under audit now. I've been staying with a friend in Arlington, but they're moving out and I don't know where else to go." She glanced up at me, voice turning bitter. "You knew about the fake sponsorships. The numbers we inflated. You must have known something." I nodded. "And you didn't say anything?" I did. "You just never listened." Her jaw clenched, and for a second I thought she might yell. But then her face crumpled. "Why didn't you stop me, Natalie?" "Because every time I tried you laughed. You said I was jealous. You said I didn't understand how the world worked." Her shoulders sagged like the fight had drained out of her. She rubbed at her eyes, smudging nothing. "I thought I was so smart, that I could stay one step ahead. That I could win on charm and branding and a few blurred lines. But the floor gave out so fast, it's like I blinked and everything I built was gone." "You didn't build it, Melissa. You borrowed it. And now the lenders come knocking." She let out a quiet, hollow laugh. "Do you hate me?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't feel hatred. Not even anger. I don't feel much of anything when it comes to you now. That might be worse." She nodded like she agreed. "I used to think you were weak. That your kindness made you small. Now I think maybe you were just brave in ways I never was." We sat in silence. The sun cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice, then went quiet again. "I can't fix this for you," I said finally. "You're going to have to figure out who you are now. Without the stage, without the script. Will you ever forgive me? I don't have an answer to that, and if I did, today wouldn't be the day to give it." She rose slowly, adjusting her bag, blinking back fresh tears she didn't bother hiding. "You're doing okay. Better than okay, probably. I just wanted you to know I see that now." I stayed seated, arms folded. She reached the door and opened it halfway. Then paused. "Tell the truth when you speak at that conference in Austin. Don't soften it for applause. Say it the way it happened." "I always do." The door clicked shut, and she was gone. No hugs, no reunions, no redemption arcs. Just a quiet collision between two people who used to share a last name and now only shared a history too warped to fix. As she sat in the visitor's chair, I noticed something else. Her nails, once manicured with seasonal designs, were chipped and uneven. The polish had worn off in flakes, and a small cut on her knuckle looked recent. It struck me how quickly the glamour had peeled away. How little was left when the audience was gone. This wasn't the woman from magazine covers or interviews. This was just Melissa. My sister. A woman who had lost the script. I made tea out of habit. 2 mugs. Mint for me, chamomile for her, the kind Mom used to brew when we were little and one of us had a bad day. I didn't ask if she wanted it, I just set it down. She didn't drink it. Just stared at the steam rising like it held an answer she couldn't see. There was a photo frame still on my desk from last fall, a candid from our team retreat in Big Bend. We were standing on a ridge, arms raised, laughing into the wind. Melissa followed my gaze and gave a faint, almost wistful smile. "That looks like joy," she said. "Not performance." I didn't know people really worked like that. Like they mattered without pretending to matter more. After she left, I sat alone in the fading light, mug still warm between my palms. The door had clicked shut like punctuation. Not an exclamation. Not even a question, just a period. I didn't cry. I didn't replay her words. I just breathed. For the first time in years, I felt the strange ache of being free of something I hadn't realized was weighing me down. She had come back, yes, but not to stay, and I wouldn't follow. The sun was still high when I stepped outside the office, the heat clinging to my skin like a quiet reminder that some things remain no matter how much life changes. Caleb was already waiting at the front steps, sleeves rolled up, tie loose, his expression calm like always. He didn't say anything. Just handed me a bottle of water and started walking beside me like we'd been doing this forever. We didn't talk about Melissa, or Evelyn, or the wreckage they were still sorting through. The silence was comforting, not strained, like the absence of chaos was enough for now. I checked my phone on instinct. There was an email notification from our new investors. Subject line: Phase 2 approved. I opened it, my thumb hovering as the words came into focus. They were in. Full support. Green light for the next round of funding. I didn't smile. Not immediately. It wasn't disbelief. It wasn't pride either. It was something quieter. Something like peace. When we reached the end of the block, I turned to Caleb. "It's happening," I said. He nodded. "You earned it. Every bit of it." No champagne, no victory speech, just a deep breath as the weight of so many years lifted an inch or two off my chest. Back at the office, Lauren had left a sticky note on my desk. She'd gone ahead to meet the new hires for onboarding. I was grateful for her presence, steady and clear. We'd both been underestimated, sidelined. Now we were the ones opening the door for others. That evening, I sat alone with my laptop in the common space, the window cracked just enough to let in the breeze and the fading hum of Austin traffic. My inbox pinged again. A new message. This one from the organizers of the Women in Leadership Conference. They wanted me as a keynote speaker. My name would headline the Saturday session. They'd already made the announcement. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about the story they wanted me to tell. The betrayal. The headlines. The family scandal that made my name familiar enough to sell tickets. I could picture the intro already. Meet the woman who lost everything and built it again from the ashes. The Phoenix narrative. Marketable. Clean. But that wasn't the truth, not the whole of it. I hadn't lost everything. I had been left behind. Excluded. Discarded like a misprinted version of someone else's perfect plan. And I hadn't risen like a firebird. I had crawled out. Piece by piece. Not with fire, but with patience. With hours no one saw. With work that no one applauded. And still here I was. I didn't reply to the invitation. Not yet. Later that night, Caleb brought takeout and we ate on the balcony overlooking the city lights. We talked about the rollout plan, the upcoming launch, the team dynamics. Safe topics. Easy ground. Then he looked at me, really looked. "Do you want to tell them?" he asked. Tell who? The world. Your side. I took a bite of cold sesame noodles and thought about it. I don't know, I said. I'm not sure it's my story anymore. I think it belongs to every woman who's ever been told to step aside quietly. Who did? Until she didn't. He nodded and didn't push. That was another thing I loved about him. No need to fill the silence. A few weeks later, I walked into a small bookstore downtown to meet a group of young founders from a mentorship circle Lauren had started. They greeted me with enthusiasm, not reverence. That mattered more than I expected. We sat in a circle with coffee cups and notebooks. No stage. No script. One of them asked me when I knew it was time to walk away. I said the moment I stopped hoping for them to change. That's when I gave myself permission to grow without permission. They all scribbled notes like I'd dropped some profound truth, but I wasn't trying to be wise. I was just being honest. Another woman raised her hand, eyes cautious. Do you think family ever really sees you? She asked. Sometimes, I said. But sometimes they only see the version of you that makes sense in their story. If that story needs a villain, then that's who you'll be. And that's not your fault. Later that week, as I stood by the window of my office, sunlight warm on my shoulder, I thought about the last photo I ever took with my family. Melissa in white. Evelyn beaming. Me in the background, half-turned eyes elsewhere. They framed that picture. Posted it. Celebrated it. I was never supposed to be part of that frame. And I no longer needed to be. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing. Not a speech, not a press statement, just a post. Something simple. A final note maybe. A bridge between what was and what could be. Thank you for following this journey. If you've ever been the one left out of the family picture, just know this. You don't have to force your way into the frame. You can create your own. One where you belong by default, not by permission. I hit send, closed the laptop, and stepped outside. The breeze had shifted. Caleb was waiting by the curb, leaning against the car with that familiar quiet patience. Ready? He asked. Yeah, I said, let's go. And we walked off together. Not toward a finale, but something more honest. A beginning. If you've ever found yourself erased, overlooked, or cast aside like I was, I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just let me know you're out there. Thank you for staying with me until the end, or rather the start.